So let's talk leadership. It's a very important stat, and many people barely scratch the surface when it comes to abusing it. Like take this situation for example. Chaos Warrior Great Weapons against Saurus Warriors. The Saurus lose, but they basically take down the Great Weapons with them. However, you can completely turn this around. If you can charge the Saurus with the Manticore at just the right time, you'll barely take any damage on either of your units. And there's many more ways to swing leadership in your favor than just getting a rear charge. But before I get into the details, I'd like to thank our sponsor today, Vigor. They sell watches with handmade leather straps, and if you're interested in purchasing one, you can use code Enticity using the link down below to get 10% off. But back to leadership, let's quickly go over its mechanics. If it hits 0 for a couple seconds, your unit's gonna rout. And for a general feel of what's high or low, well, Chaos Warriors are a good starting point. At 75 leadership, they'll basically fight to the last as long as there's no external factors. But dropping only 15 leadership down to 60 will have a massive effect on how the units feel. For example, Ogre Bulls at 60 will only fight to about half HP before they start running. And then you have units like Trolls with a base leadership of 45 who really don't like staying in combat. And in fact, their leadership is so low, it's not entirely uncommon to see them rout at 80% HP. And speaking of routing, there is an interesting mechanic you might not know about. And that's the fact that units can only rout 3 times before they shatter off the battlefield, regardless of HP. Now this doesn't include Terra routes, but if you've ever wondered why your Trolls are shattering at high HP, that's why. And while we're on the topic of Terror, it's pretty important to know which circumstances affect leadership the most. And starting off with Fear, it comes packed in with Terror and is on many units. It gives a -8 leadership debuff in an aura around the unit. And as for Terror, it's a -13 leadership debuff that gets a unit to rout immediately, but it's a temporary rout, only lasting about 3 seconds. And there's also the notable Attacked in the Rear debuff for -14 leadership, and the Attacked in the Flank debuff, which is -6. And yes, they are 2 completely different debuffs that do stack on top of each other. And also very important to note, you can't trigger both of these debuffs with a single charge. And while each of these debuffs aren't individually very scary, if you can get all of them stacked together, you're looking at a -41 leadership debuff. And taken to its extremes, you can get a lot done with this. Now there are many other leadership debuffs in the game, and while they're good to know, they're generally less impactful than the ones stated earlier. Now all these different debuffs might be overwhelming to you, but thankfully in practice, you don't need to know any of it. To get the most out of leadership tactics, all you need is a mobile terror-causing unit and something that can do good burst damage, typically a caster. And after that, all you have to do is survey the battlefield for good targets. If you see a unit with 2/3 leadership, a charge in the back with Terror is usually just enough to get them to rout. And if they're sitting at 1/3 leadership, your Terror-causing unit doesn't even have to attack them for them to rout. And for units only slightly under full leadership, you'll need to put in a little bit more effort. You'll have to hit them with some sort of shock damage before you head in, and you have to be pretty sure they're gonna rout, otherwise your Terror-causing unit can get stuck and take a lot more damage than they signed up for. But as a rule of thumb, most units are a lot easier to rout than you might think. For example, if we take a look at these Marauders of Khorne, they can be routed basically as soon as combat starts. But there are some abilities you have to look out for that will really give terror bombing a hard time. For example, units with immune to psychology or units that are undead or demons will be immune to fear and terror. And this means terror bombing them with the Manticore becomes essentially useless. But for units with frenzy like Khorne's Marauders from earlier, it actually provides no benefits, and that's because Frenzy goes away as soon as they drop below 50% leadership, after which they're immediately suffering the penalties of Fear and Terror, which basically gets them routed off immediately. And as for fear-causing units like Trolls, while the fact they cause fear does allow them to ignore it, it won't do anything about Terror. So a charge in the back with the Manticore is still a very significant -27 leadership debuff. And one last ability you might not consider as a leadership buff is actually Perfect Vigor. You can find it on Sigvald, and if we put him up against a mage with 10 times more HP than usual, don't ask about it, then we can truly see just how high his leadership is in the face of terror. On top of his already extremely high 100 leadership, his ITP essentially increases his leadership by 21, and his Perfect Vigor is another 6 on top of that. And obviously, this basically makes him unbreakable compared to other units. And now that you have a good feel on leadership, I highly recommend checking out my video on armor. It's a stat many people underestimate because they can't quickly calculate how much it's actually blocking.